Hello and welcome to our penultimate talk of our series on railways across the Commonwealth. This series has been organised by the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, which is a membership charitable organisation that was set up to share knowledge and experience of our shared built heritage across the Commonwealth. One of our aims is conservation, and we have enabled some projects to teach heritage skills whilst recording or repairing historic buildings in countries across the Commonwealth. Another of our aims is education, of which this lecture series forms part. Previous talks from this series and from other series, such as that on botanic gardens and on cemeteries, can be found on our website if you're interested. And if you want to hear any more about the CHF, then do get in touch. For now, let's turn to our topic for tonight's talk, the locomotive building sector in Leeds, England, and its exports around the world. I'm delighted to introduce John McGoldrick, who is Curator of Industrial History at Leeds Museums and Galleries, a post he's held for nearly a decade. Previously, he was Curator of Museum Collections at the National Railway Museum in York, and has also held posts as a curator at Lancashire Museums and Bolton Museums and Art Galleries. The topic he's looking at today is one that they've been researching for about 5 years at Leeds Museums, and really this is an opportunity for him to share insights from that research and also some of the questions that they've been exploring. So I shall hand over to him in just a moment. If you want to ask a question, then there'll be an opportunity at the end. You can put your question in the chat function, or you can raise a hand at the end. Megan will be sort of curating the question element. You may have seen the red recording button on the screen. This lecture is being recorded, so please keep yourselves muted during the course of the lecture. And I'll hand over to John. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much, Rowenna, and it's lovely to stroke scary to see so many people calling in to the talk. It's hopefully not too kind of big a subject for me to cover, and I just really want to try and give you a little bit of an insight, as Rowenna said, into what we've been looking at. So let's share my screen. So we have, as part of our industrial collections at Leeds Museums and Galleries, you could say it was a part of our jewel in our crown, is the locomotive collection. And we have a good representation of about 6 of the main makers of Leeds locomotive building industry. It's not a particularly well-known topic outside of Leeds, I'd probably venture. And Leeds was actually the largest producer of locomotives in Britain, with the exception of Glasgow. In the talk, I'm not going to talk too much, or not going to show too many images of shiny locomotives. That's been done by many people who are much more knowledgeable in terms of engineering. I'm not an engineer, and that might possibly come across in the talk tonight. I'm particularly more interested in the kind of social context and the economic context of what was happening around the production of the locomotive industry in Leeds. Just as a bit of red meat for the locomotive enthusiasts who may be among us, this is a Nigeria Railways locomotive, just all loaded up on its trailer, ready to go off to Birkenhead for export to Nigeria in about 1946. And one of the points I kind of want to open up with really is the sheer scale of the locomotive building industry in Leeds, and the importance of exports in that industry. There would have been really no viable locomotive industry in Leeds if it were not for exports, and particularly exports to Britain's former colonies and other powers colonies as well. There were estimates around about 1890 of about 5,000 men employed in the locomotive building industry in Leeds. And that obviously kind of waxed and waned as kind of the economic fortunes rose and fell. But the export trade was really a key part of keeping these companies afloat. As I said, our collections represent about 6 of the major builders, and there were really about half a dozen of these builders who came and went over about a century and a half of building from about 1830 in Leeds. So this is a bit of a lockdown project that I started in about 2020. This was around the time of the Rodney King death and the Black Lives Matter movement that was getting going around about 2020. Now it seems like an awful long time ago. And this prompted Leeds Museums and Galleries as an institution to start looking at colonial legacies in our collections right across. We've got a wide range of collections from natural sciences to archaeology to industrial history and social history. So this prompted us to start looking at what kind of resources we have as an industrial collection. There's an awful lot to look at, as you can see from some of the resources that I've highlighted here. And one of the projects I wanted to sort of try and start was to try and map where some of the locomotives and other railway products actually went out to from Leeds over the period in question. So I'll see if I'm really interested in trying to click the link and see what happened in terms of actually showing you, what happened in terms of our research. So zooming in, be aware obviously then we just managed to kind of look at Africa in this particular bit of research. And this is something we probably want to try and develop further with other partnerships. I'll just go on to one particular area. This is Mombasa. And what we've done with the project is to sort of try and research, partly using a resource called Leeds Engine, which is a really, really well-researched railway enthusiast sort of led site based in Leeds. And they've basically scanned order books for all the major kind of locomotive companies. And I've tried to add to that kind of information with any resources that might be available. This one looks really unpromising, but this guy called Roger Farmer come up with some really interesting information about some of the locomotives that were produced by Kitson's, for example. So this is the kind of information that we're really trying to bring to the fore. So if anyone's got any enthusiasm or ideas about how we might be able to sort of take this particular project forward, I'd be very interested to hear. One of the things I'd quite like to investigate is the potential of linking up with museums in former British colonies, whether that's in Africa or India, and just seeing what the interest is in developing links and just kind of furthering research in that topic. So this is a Hunslet area, and that's what I'm going to kind of focus on in this particular talk for the start of it. Hunslet previously in the early 1800s, 1700s, had really only been a textile producing district, like much of the rest of Leeds. Leeds made its money in the woolen industry chiefly, but there is a bit of a kind of a misconception that the woolen industry was the key thing in developing Leeds' kind of prominence as an industrial powerhouse in the UK to rival centres like Manchester, Glasgow, London, Birmingham. So Hunslet is a district just immediately to the south of the River Aire. The River Aire sort of bisects Leeds, and Hunslet is immediately just to the south of the river. And this there's an image from a book about the Hunslet engine works by Don Townsley, and he's basically mapped all the major producers of locomotives in the area. It's a real historical oddity, why so many many locomotive producers kind of clustered in one particular area. And I'm not sure that anyone is really kind of fully explained it and bottomed that. One of the earliest sites you probably see is the one that's labelled A, and that was the Airedale Foundry, and that was essentially inhabited by Kitson's and Company. I just referred to them in the previous slide, and they provided a lot of locomotives to Africa, particularly the Uganda Railway and many others. This was the site of probably one of the most kind of picturesque scenes in the 1830s, where the company of Todd, Kitson and Laird unleashed the locomotive Lion, which was made for the Liverpool Manchester Railway upon the world. It was actually built in a former textile mill, which is quite a nice metaphor for how the engineering trade in Leeds actually evolved from the textile industry. And building this locomotive, they were actually sharing space with textile machinery at the time. When it came to release the locomotive, they had to knock down walls to get the locomotive out and unleash a line upon the world. There's all sorts of kind of debates about whether the line that's held by Liverpool museums now is the actual line that was produced by Todd, Kitson and Laird, but that's for someone else to get into. You can see Block E, and that's the site of the Hunslet Engine Works. That is obviously quite a constricted site. It was obviously hemmed in by Jack Lane, which runs along from diagonally across the picture, and also hemmed in by Chancel Street. So they're working with a very sort of tight location, which obviously impacted on their sort of scope for expansion. But you can see there's a whole ecosystem of different producers in the area. Huns that were right next door to neighbours, Manning, Wardle and Company. These are probably names, if you're not familiar with the Leeds locomotive industry, they're not exactly household names. And this is one of the issues with presenting the heritage of Leeds locomotive building. Because of the nature of a lot of the locomotives, they were built for unglamorous purposes. Many, as I've said before, made for export. So by definition, they're a kind of vanishing product, and they have just not kind of lodged largely in the public consciousness. There was an earlier history of mainline locomotive building in Leeds, but none of those locomotives really survived anywhere beyond the 1890s. So they very much disappeared from the public view. So you're getting a kind of sense of how kind of dense and how kind of intensive that locomotive building industry was in the area. And Hunslet wasn't exactly the prettiest area. There's a nice report from the Yorkshire Post and Leeds Intelligencer from 1893, sharing location with the local steelworks, which was the scene of much pollution and industrial accidents as well. They had a famous boiler explosion in the early 1900s, which wiped out 20 or so residents and had a major impact on the area. So heavily industrialised area. Start zooming in a little bit closer. Our collection have a really good range of engineering drawings and also architectural plans that kind of give us a bit of a fighting chance of kind of understanding what's actually going on in some of these works. It's an important way of actually letting us into of how the works actually functioned, where these details haven't really been kind of captured by oral history or some of the written histories. And it's these kinds of illustrations and resources that we're trying to make speak a little bit more to us. this the image reminds me of I think it was the summer before last, and I was asked by Tim Dunn and the people who make the architecture, the Railways Built programme, to talk about some of the locomotive industry in Leeds. So after going to the Round Foundry, or the site of the Round Foundry, which was the kind of the nucleus of the original Leeds locomotive building industry, we went down to Jack Lane, which is the road that you see in this image, and this was about 5:30 on a busy weekday night, and after a long day filming in the sun and getting sunburned, and amidst being kind of shouted at by every second car that passed, and the horn beeping, we were sort of trying to work out where the actual tracks that came out from the Hunslet Engine Works were. There's three sets of tracks that still exist in the road, and we eventually worked out it was this central set of tracks, and this is where almost all of the products that came out from the Hunslet Engine Works would have come out. So this isn't one of their export locomotives. This is probably something like a 204 horsepower diesel that was made for British railway operations. So, but in some ways, it's kind of revered by railway enthusiasts, and there's this kind of ghost-like quality to these tracks that are coming out from a now sort of largely disappeared factory. The site's been taken over by a company called Schneider, and there's really not a lot left, if anything, of the Hunslet Engine Works. To the left of the engine works, there's a set of gates that belong to the Manning Wardle Works from the 1850s, but there's not an awful lot left. So there's a kind of it's an interesting quality to that site and those rails. The fact that they survived, I think, is interesting, and maybe kind of gives us some links to kind of railways in other territories. So we've been doing some looking at what the actual working conditions were for people who were building these locomotives, that eventually ended up in territories right across the globe. In this particular case, where we're looking at British Empire, and I think this has largely been overlooked in terms of academic study, and the law, a huge amount of enthusiast based study that's been done. A lot of the publications have been very concerned with technical details of the locomotives, which is a whole interesting story in its own right, but and the workers' experiences are kind of very much treated as a kind of sideline, which is something that we want to sort of try and address, and it's something that we're talking to academic partners as well, and we've got a funding application in at the moment to sort of try and do more of that and look at the actual working conditions and how aware the workers would have been of where these products were going to, and what kind of conditions people at the receiving end would have been working under. So you can deduce all sorts of conditions from sort of drawings like this. You can have a look at kind of things related to worker control, the fact that the workers had to kind of go through sort of time office as well. These are all things that we want to look at quite closely. Another way of illustrating working conditions, this particular, it's a logbook that was created for a lockout that happened in 1897. There was a major strike, the engineers' strike, and this was the first major kind of nationwide strike where a fully kind of organised union, the Amalgamated Engineers Union, had sort of set up against companies. And the companies themselves were starting to work together as well. They had kind of company associations, and this strike was prompted by the attempt by companies to try and introduce kind of semi-mechanised ways of working. So they were introducing machine tools and really attacking or undermining traditional kind of crafts that had built up over the 20, 30 years before that. And it's an illustration, this particular individual, Arthur Shaw, who had been involved in the strike and who's clearly an organizer and had been kind of sort of identified by the management. So when he kind of came back to sort of, after being on strike, to sort of try and get his job back, he was giving short shrift really in terms of getting his job back. So this is the kind of colour they want to start trying to bring to the story. Some of the other drawings, this one's from 1990, and these are kind of really kind of zooming in on working conditions, and in a way that we probably haven't really looked at up to now, and hopefully we can do more of that kind of work. Top left image, you can see that they started to introduce fans and fan extraction into the machine shop. So there's evidence of they're actually paying attention, or a little bit of attention to kind of worker conditions. Obviously, if you're working with wood or metal, you don't want particles flying about your workshop too much. So they're obviously improving the working environment there. Bottom left, you're kind of zooming into a couple of sort of radial drills. These are the kind of heavy duty machines that would have made it possible to kind of mass produce locomotives on the scale that was needed. And the little kind of line that you can see here, look at the gearing for the attached to the line crafting, which is the kind of the powering system that would have powered everything that happened in the workshop. As things improved and things changed, circumstances dictated companies that changed their facilities, and in 1917 you can see that the Hunslet Engine Company introduced a women's canteen. The Hunslet Engine Company were very proactive in employing women in the locomotive building industry, both in World War I, but also in World War II, and they continued to employ women for some time after the war. So that's an image of a pneumatic steam hammer, and the women actually operating the controls for that. Yeah. This is an image from the Sierra Leone National Rail Museum collection, and I was talking about rails that were still surviving in the Hunslet area in a couple of slides ago. I was lucky enough to go with Helen Ashby and Steve Davis from the Sierra Leone National Rail Museum Friends to Sierra Leone in 2020 to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the museum there. And one of the activities we did was we walked the area of the former Water Street station, and the site has changed dramatically from this image, as you can probably imagine. The railway station buildings that you can see kind of in the top left, those have been taken over as the kind of the city bus station now. But we did quite an interesting exercise in actually trying to identify where the tracks still survived, a bit like in the Hunslet area, and just to see what physical remnants there were of the railway. And it was quite a strange experience where basically the area has been sort of taken over partly by temporary housing. I've just sort of your slide here of a left of the area. This is what was Water Street, and I think that's the building that was the railway station for Freetown. The blue shapes behind the railway station, those are generally when you see blue in Freetown, those are generally kind of temporary kind of tarpaulins that people use for the shelters. And while we were trying to find the tracks, we were kind of walking right next to sort of people's mattresses and people's sort of bedding. So it was was a very, very odd experience, and kind of it just made me think about, you know, that kind of a slightly ghost-like presence of railways, and how that in some ways is mirrored in the Leeds experience, of that kind of industry basically disappearing. And one of the areas that we'd quite like to sort of focus on is, you know, what's the impact of losing your railway, both from the production side, but also from the kind of the user side, and kind of what kind of effect that has on population, and how it's actually memorialized and kind of marked in a physical way. Street that I've just kind of shown you an image of, it was called Water Street, but it's now, I mean, when I was there, I saw this really kind of dust-covered sign called Wallace Johnson Street, and it was named after ITA Wallace Johnson, who was a trade union activist in Sierra Leone in the 1930s. He managed to get himself arrested by the colonial authorities in 1940, and for most of the rest of the Second World War, he was locked up as a potential troublemaker. He was involved in organising railway workers in Sierra Leone. He actually attended a European conference of railway workers in Germany under a pseudonym, but he managed to make it onto a 2 leones banknote in Sierra Leone. So he's found his place in Sierra Leone history and in the kind of public consciousness. But he's one of those kind of individual human stories that we've been sort of looking at and trying to kind of bring to the fore. Jumping back to Leeds, this is a clutch plate mechanism that was made by someone who was involved in the production side, and this was a guy called Huey Wilkinson. This is on display in Leeds City Museum in the Leeds story, and I just love the jewel-like quality of this piece, and it's obviously been made with you know, great care and a whole kind of ecosystem of knowledge, expertise that's built up around the locomotive industry in Leeds and other sort of similar cities in Britain. He was a commissioning engineer for the Hunslet Engine Company, and one of his jobs was to go out when Hunslet supplied locomotives to could be a domestic customer, or could be colonial or overseas customer. And one of the part of the research that we've been doing, we're constantly finding new material. This is one of the joys stroke challenges of working in the museum collection. We're constantly documenting new material. We found his logbook from some of his overseas and domestic jobs, and this one was from a Sisal estate in Africa. It doesn't actually say which one, but it's an interesting insight into how attitudes of the time kind of actually governed engineering decisions, frankly, because they had a kind of a view on the sort of suitability of some of the indigenous workers in terms of how they would operate clutch pedals on locomotive footplates, and because of those attitudes, they came up with a technological approach. You notice I didn't say solution, so a technological approach that kind of met with their approval based on their attitudes to the indigenous workers. So it's kind of piecing together all these different snippets of information sometimes that we're kind of trying to get a better understanding of the whole picture, really. Huey worked for the Hunslet Engine Company for well over 40 years. He retired in 1988, and this is a really nice model of a Hunslet diesel that was presented to him when he finished working with the Hunslet Engine Company. He was also a volunteer at Leeds Industrial Museum for quite some time, and provided his knowledge and expertise in some of the restoration projects that were carried out. There were about 3 locomotives that were restored at the museum with Hugh's help. So it's an interesting exercise, and someone who actually lived the history, was involved in the building and commissioning of engines, is actually coming back to a museum and actually rebuilding and retelling the story. So it's quite a powerful thing. Another image from kindly approved by Helen at the Sierra Leone National Rail Museum, and this ties us into another personality. The image on the left is depicts the supervisor, construction supervisor, who was brought in to build the Sierra Leone government railway, and this is about 1904, 1905, I believe. And what you see there is a train of Hunslet tipper wagons, Robert Hudson tipper wagons. This was another company who supplies light railway solutions for a variety of overseas and domestic British customers. One of the interesting things in this image is the locomotive at the back, which has a nameplate on I think in front of the funnel, the chimney, called Bai Bury. And Bai Bury was a chief of the Temne tribe, and he engaged in some resistance to kind of British attempts to impose what was called a hut tax on the population, partly to pay for the building of the railway. Is one of the reasons the hut tax was actually levied. And it's an interesting conundrum. I'm not sure, and Helen may be able to kind of enlighten us in the discussion afterwards, whether we got to the bottom of why Bybury had a locomotive named after him, after he'd caused quite a lot of havoc in terms of his attacks. I think they actually delayed the building of the railway at one point as well. So it'd be an interesting one to discuss. The image on the right is Bybury, I believe, after he surrendered himself. And after he surrendered, he was exiled to the Gold Coast. Yet another individual back in Leeds now, and you can see we're sort of trying to make these sort of links between the kind of colonial territories and the colonial metropolis. This is a kind of, for want of a better word, a dossier that was created by a guy called Jack Remington. So Jack Remington worked for Robert Hudson's between 1916 and 1967. So over 40 years of service, and this is particularly a really valuable resource in terms of just giving us an insight into who the people were, who was involved, working with the company, what were the practices, and Jack has actually he's no longer with us, sadly, but he's left handwritten notes, autobiographical notes that when we have some more research resource, we're going to sort of try and dig into. But this particular document, it's quite. There's a reason why I've kind of blacked out some of the names, because not all of the comments are particularly nice, but they're very kind of open and informative, I suppose, in some way. So I've kind of redacted some of them. And he talked about everybody who he encountered in his 40 years with the company. So that could be range from kind of managers of a kind of sector of Africa who was responsible for the whole business of Robert Hudson's in Africa, or it can range to a joiner, and what kind of guy he was. He even talks about one of the wives you see on the slide there. The wives of the manager of the Robert Hudson's in India, she could have won a packet on a horse if they'd actually taken Jack's advice on a betting tip. So this is the kind of information that we want to try and to add in to the existing, the extensive work that's been done on the technical aspects of the collection, and hopefully that will allow us to sort of try and tell much more complete stories. And this is just to give you some kind of a idea of the kind of work that Robert Hudson's did. They supplied not just wagons, but light railway solutions right across the world, and in Britain. If you had a mine to open, say gold mine, all you had to do was just contact Hudson's with the dimensions, the shape of the site, gradients, that kind of detail, and they would do a lot of the calculations for you, and they produce quite an interesting business model in producing effectively a train set for or a kit of parts for whatever industrial purpose that you actually wanted. So yeah, a very successful company, and they were continuing right up into the 1980s. One of the biggest projects they were involved in was the building of the Luanda Railway in former Portuguese West Africa, now Angola, and this was in the 1920s. And Hudson's, I think he's actually got an order for about £900,000 at the time, which I've worked out equates to about £55 million in terms of the value of a contract to build an entire railway in that territory. And this is an image from one of the catalogues, so it's not something we've kind of gone deep digging for. This is something they depicted to sort of try and sort of show some of the projects they were involved in, and some of the research that was done at the time sort of raised the issue of kind of forced labour in the territory. There was a League of Nations inquiry into the building of the railway, and in Portuguese West Africa, there's quite a lot of forced labour happening, where gangs were rounded up using chains and marched, from whichever village or area they lived in to basically be forced to work on a particular railway. So that was a Portuguese colony. So that was the issues there, and it was described by Edward Ross, who was an American academic at the time who looked and visited the colony. He was described as effectively forced labour, or serf labour. And this is also from Robert Hudson's catalogue, I think the late 1920s catalogue. Hudson's produced a huge range of different types of wagon, whether that was for coal mining, gold mining, diamond mining, sisal farming, or sugarcane farming in the case of these particular wagons. And this is a couple of the Hudson's engineers visiting on site. They didn't just kind of do things at arm's length. They actually sent their employees out, a bit like Huey Wilkinson, who went out for Hudson's for the Hunslet Engine Company. They did actually go out and look at how the products were working on the ground. So they were very sort of conscientious suppliers, it could be said. I've been talking a lot about the Hunslet Engine Company and latterly Robert Hudson's, but other companies were involved in Leeds. It was a huge ecosystem, and this couple of products were produced by the Leeds Forge Company. It's a company that was set up by a guy called Samson Fox. It's a name to conjure with, and Samson Fox has some quite notable descendants, including people who are involved in stage and screen. I've tried to remember the name of his descendant who came. She actually came back to our museum to look at. It was a corrugated flue that Samson Fox had designed. Our name will come to me. So Samson Fox invested really heavily in technology that allowed them to basically fold metal and large pieces of metal extremely efficiently. So as well as producing boiler flues for things like shipping, they got into the trade of building metal and lightweight all metal wagons and carriages. And there was a real range of material. The slide on the right shows you them exporting a first-class carriage. This has been sort of loaded a hull, and that's the kind of the top end of the kind of the product that they were supplying. They also supplied all steel carriages to the blue train, the train that ran from Paris down to the south of France. So these were products that were kind of built in very kind of working class areas of Leeds. It's a picture to conjure with. The carriage or wagon on the left was called by the company a special bulky pilgrim coach, and these were made for the Barcy Light Railway in the 1920s, and these were primarily kind of cargo or freight wagons, but they were actually pressed into service during the Mela festival periods, where large numbers of people wanted to sort of travel around the country. And they were effectively wagons for humans. There were no seats in them, and precious little in the way of ventilation or windows. And there was a legal case brought by Mr. Narayan in the late 1930s. He'd paid for a third-class ticket on the Barcy Light Railway, but that third-class carriage was not available, so he was shown into one of these pilgrim coaches, and he took the Barcy Light Railway to court. There was a lot of complaints. Passenger kind of groups were frequently complaining about the use of these, and it's interesting that the Leeds Forest Company knew what they were producing, because they called the coach what it was, and this is like kind of an out shopping photograph that would have been taken just as the carriage or the wagon was ready to go off to the customer. So yeah, there's a real range of material produced. And kind of to drop on to kind of something that's a kind of a question of, I suppose, built heritage in some ways. This is a locomotive which was eventually called Cheetle, and this was built by another company, John Fowler and Company. John Fowler sort of started work in actually inventing steam plows and applying steam technology to agriculture, and they made huge inroads in that field, but they were also extremely active in producing steam locomotives, and were very kind of to the forefront of producing diesel locomotives in the 20th century. So this locomotive was supplied to the Karachi Port Trust. It had quite a checkered and quite a varied history. This is the Karachi port around about the time when it would have been supplied, and it was probable that it was being used for the building works and extensions that were going on at the port. There was a huge amount of expansion at the time, and the lines up at the top left, that's land that they were reclaiming at Karachi to expand the port and develop it further. I mean, you can see from the aerial photograph and the map, the existing network of rails is just mind blowing, and it gives you an insight into the sheer volume of products that were being processed through the port. The area around Karachi was known as a kind of as a breadbasket of India, so they were exporting a lot of wheat as well as cotton from the port of Karachi. So from there, the locomotive that got involved in a huge building project. It was a civil engineering project up in the north of India. It became known as the Lloyd Barrage, and this photograph doesn't really do it justice. It's about 8 times the length of this photograph, and that was described as the largest irrigation scheme. It was associated with 7 other canals that were used to irrigate the area. It was also described by the British press as the kind of the greatest gift that Britain had given to the welfare of India. So from there, people then went to this particular sugar plantation and underwent quite a lot of technological changes as a result of the change of use. For the first couple of uses, it would have had quite short runs and wouldn't really have required a lot of water to make it steam. But working on this particular sugar plantation, they decided they needed to add an additional water tank onto the back of just behind the cab, as you can see there. So an example of how changes of use and the kind of the just continuing life of a locomotive can actually sort of change and kind of introduce new components onto it. So this particular locomotive was brought back in association with Amberley Chalk Pit Museum in the early 1980s. And we currently have it out on loan to another railway organisation. And there's a whole kind of range of choices that you can make in terms of how you approach its conservation. You can conserve it, restore it, whatever term you want to use, for return to steam, which is often some rail enthusiasts' first sort of port of call. That can involve a complete replacement of parts. A lot of the parts were actually stripped off this particular locomotive, during its life, towards the end of its life, and also while it was waiting to come across back to Britain. So you can return it to steam, you can restore it to within an inch of its life, and repaint and buff everything up to within an inch of its life. Another approach could be to treat it as an item of industrial archaeology in some ways, and excuse me, and reflect the kind of the hard life that some of these locomotives had, and some of the compromises that were made in maintaining and keeping these things running. So that's a kind of an example, I suppose, of some of the questions that we were kind of currently asking ourselves about locomotive like this that's still in our collection. It's also an interesting way of potentially involving local communities in Leeds. We've got communities represented from India and Pakistan very strongly in Leeds, so that's something that we kind of potentially want to consult and get their thoughts on how that story affected them. I was in contact with a company called Cheetal Technology in Pakistan a couple of years ago in an attempt to get to the bottom of the mystery of the name. The name was commonly believed to be the misspelling of cheetah, which I wanted to question. And from talking to this company called Cheetal Tech in Karachi, it was just kind of simply explained to me as the cheetal is a small deer that's kind of common to the South Asian subcontinent. So that's I'll take that. That's my kind of my answer to what the name actually means. So that's something that we're continuing to think about, and talking about options as a way of almost representing that return of products that went out from Leeds, and what we actually do with them when they come back here, how we treat them. Do we talk about them as being everything's a positive story, or do we try and tell a more nuanced story in terms of the communities who built those locomotives? What's happened to those communities, what's happened to the area. An area like Hunslet is quite seriously deprived area. It's got a high crime rate. Not many people live there now, but also in terms of people whose parents or grandparents might have kind of worked on locomotives like this in India and Pakistan, worked in both territories. So they're quite interesting issues, and with the information that we've been gleaning from our collections alone, not to mention the wider collections that are available, it's something that we're quite excited about investigating. So that's me finished with my slides, and I'm very happy to answer any questions or kind of get involved in discussions on the basis of that.
Thank you, John. That was absolutely fascinating and amazing how you managed to connect what was happening in Leeds to the different stories happening all over Africa and Asia. We have some questions in the chat. So I'll start off by reading those out. If anybody else has a question, then please do put up your hand and feel free to say it in person. So the first question was just a request to have the Google map link added to the chat before the end of the session. The next was to ask whether you'd look through back issues of the Railway Gazette International, which often had features from loco builders that were that they were building locos for exports.
But yeah, I have Railway Gazette International. Yeah, I was going to refer to that. I couldn't access my slides, my slide notes, so I didn't remember to mention that. But yeah, there was certainly a reference to Sierra Leone and some of the uses of the railway that was built there in terms of extracting palm kernels. So yeah, it's a good resource. Yeah, thank you.
The next question from Andy Battis is, how did all these heavy machines get to port for shipping and export? And Michael Ellison has noted that in Glasgow, the North British locos used steam traction engines to take them to Finnieston, where they were craned onto the ship. So have you seen similar patterns from the Leeds factories?
Yeah, often we can by road to port or to the nearest railhead, and yes, they did use steam traction to do that. I think that first image I showed of the Nigeria Railway locomotive, that was using steam traction to steam rod traction. Yeah.
Thank you. That's all the questions that are in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? Jeremy Harrison has his hand up. Jeremy, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah,
please?
I was going to say two questions really. Do you have any sort of connection with the Middleton Railway, which is your local preserved railway in Leeds? Do you liaise with them in any way?
Yeah, we do. We've got really good relationship with the
Yep.
Middleton. They help us on lots of kind of technical matters, and we loan material to them too. They've got some models on loan and pieces of the original Middleton Railway wrapping pinion track on loan from us. Yeah.
You're good. The other thing I noticed in your last image of Chitral, the women in the foreground, and I assume they were doing patties of dung to use as fuel.
I think that's right. Yes, I'm sure I've read that.
Whether that was actually used by the loco or
Probably not the loco. But I'm open to being corrected on that. But yeah, I've read somewhere else that it was fuel.
yeah. I say when I went to Pakistan, it was a few years ago now, but not that long ago, and there were you would see these patties on the side of houses of the dung drying out for cooking the following day. Anyway, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Julian, you had your hand up next. Would you like to ask your question, please?
It was really more a comment on Bureau. That was the smallest locomotive on the line. And I was wondering, I've always wondered since I found out about it, if it wasn't a political statement that he was exiled, was it just a statement to say you're not as big and as hard as the Great White Queen at Windsor? Is it as simple as that? He was a warlord.
I didn't catch all of.
Sorry, can't you hear my right? Bureau was the smallest loco on the line. His revolt was in about 1894, 1895, after they introduced the hut tax. Was it just a statement to say, okay, we acknowledge your war prowess, because he brought his what they called the war boys into action, but was it a statement to say, you're actually a very small fish in a very big sea?
That's a kind of quite compelling theory. Yeah, I don't know whether Helen might have any thoughts on this. I don't know if you researched that at all. Sorry to put you on the spot, Helen.
I think Aisatu might know better than me, being a Sierra Leonean historian, if she's still on here. But I think it's more likely that it was a fairly small person, but pretty powerful. So small engine, quite powerful. And there does seem to be a Sierra Leone tradition of kind of forgiving people and naming things after them. I mean, there's a Bible-Ray Road, there's Shaka Stevens Street, and he wasn't the most popular politician in the country. So I'm not really sure of the origins of it, but I think it's more like little but tough.
Thank you.
Sorry, 2 engines named on that line, Helen. But we know about having actually carried names. Bureau was one, and there was the first Garrett was also named.
Yeah, and quite a lot of the early Hunslet 262 tanks were as well.
Did they actually carry those names? I know they were ordered.
Yeah, I've got photographs of them, of some of them.
Good. Ooh.
Yeah, definitely. The other comment I wanted to make is the comment that was made on fuel. I don't think the patties were used for the loco, because what was actually used generally on the sugar locos was the bagasse, which in the picture you could see in the wagons behind the engine. So it was the waste from the sugarcane that was actually used as fuel.
Thank you, Helen. It's 7 o'clock. We'll just take the last question from Richard Whitehead before we draw things to a close. Richard?
Other than Hunslet, who we know survived into the diesel era, did any of the other manufacturers survive that long?
Right, I've just missed the start of your question. I think my connection is starting to kind of die. So sorry, Richard. Could you just
Yeah.
that again?
Other than Hunslet, who we know survived into the diesel era, how many of the other manufacturers managed to survive that long?
I don't think any of the other locomotive manufacturers managed to survive and kind of acquire their goodwill and intellectual property, and they took over companies across the country as well, including Avonside and Andrew Barclay up in Kilmarnock. Robert Hudson's survived in terms of wagon building. They survived, well into the 80s, if not the 1990s. So they kind of diversified quite a bit. So they were still going. But as far as I'm aware, Hunslet were the last survivors, and they even got involved in making electric multiple units for British Rail at the time, which are still running about. You see them at Crewe Station these days. So, but they're not the most popular units, I believe.
Well, thank you ever so much, John. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, and thank you for taking questions at the end. We've got one more talk left in our series, which is next Wednesday at the same time. We saw some images from Sierra Leone in John's talk. The next talk is on the Sierra Leone Railway and the creation of the National Railway Museum in Sierra Leone. And that's going to be given by Helen Ashby, who we've just heard from, and Colonel Steve Davies. So please do join us if you can. I think Megan's going to put a link in the chat now that it'll also be available on our website. So do join us. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And please join us again for the final lecture of the series. Thank you. And thank you again to John.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.